Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Kosmopoulos. I'm the chair of Greek Studies at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And on behalf of the Greek Professorship and the university, I would like to welcome you to today's event. The lecture today is the 10th annual Dr. Nicholas Matsakis Memorial Lecture. Before I introduce the speaker, please allow me to say a couple of things about Dr. Nicholas Matsakis, who for half a century was one of the pillars of the Greek community here in St. Louis. In memory of Dr. Matsakis, his family has endowed the annual Matsakis Lecture, and this is Dr. Matsakis with his wonderful wife Theodora and the three children, Elias, Dimitris, and Aphrodite, to whom we are very grateful, not only for endowing this lecture series, but also for establishing the Greek Culture Center at the University of Missouri campus. So Dimitri, Elia, and Aphrodite, we are very grateful for your generosity and your friendship. Thank you. The lecture today is part of the Greek Professorship series of events celebrating and commemorating the 200th anniversary of the Greek War of Independence. We have a series of events planned that originally were supposed to take place in 2021, but because of the pandemic, we had to push some of them into 2022. This series includes lectures, screening of films about the Greek Revolution, a music performance in February 2022, a conference, and also two exhibitions at the Matsakis Greek Culture Center. I would like to kindly ask you to visit the Greek Professorship website, simply www.greekstudies.org, where you will find a link to all these events. This is our portal. This is the portal for anything Greek that is happening that's happening on our campus. It is a real pleasure and an honor to welcome today's speaker. Dr. Bettany Hughes is an acclaimed historian, author, and broadcaster. She is a scholar at Oxford University, and she has also taught at she has also taught at Cambridge University and lectured at Cornell, at Bristol, at University College London, at Maastricht, Utrecht, Manchester. She is a well sought out lecturer and scholar. This year, she will join the new College of the Humanities in London as a visiting professor. Bettany has written and presented over 50 TV, here you are, and radio documentaries for the BBC, Channel 4, Discovery, PBS, the History Channel, National Geographic, BBC World, and ITV. And her programs have now been seen by over 250 million viewers worldwide. At the same time, Bettany is an accomplished scholar. She has published several books, which you see here. Her first book, Helen of Troy, has been translated into 10 languages, and her second book, The Hemlock Cup, was a New York Times bestseller. Among the other books, the most recent ones are a book on the history of Istanbul, Constantinople, and this is the topic of today's lecture, and most recently, Venus and Aphrodite, a history of a goddess. On a personal level, I would like to tell you that I've known Bettany for many years now. She's absolutely a joy and a pleasure to work with. We've worked together on several projects, and also both myself and my wife Deborah have worked with her. And she's one of those people who is an amazing person, in addition to being a wonderful scholar and a TV personality. Today's lecture, as I said, is about the history of Constantinople, Istanbul, and with this, Bettany, I would like to welcome you and give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Michael. I mean, what a generous introduction. How do I follow that? What a pleasure it is to be with you again. I think we've just realised that it was 15 years ago that I came and lectured in person. So let's try and hope it's not another 15 years before we all see one another in the flesh again. Just a big thank you to the Matsakis family for sponsoring this series of lectures. As I said, anything that we can do to share knowledge and ideas and a delight in the world is a wonderful thing, particularly now we all realise after 18 months of living through COVID. So just thank you for your sagacity and wisdom in sponsoring this series. And as Michael has said, indeed, tonight the subject of my talk is going to be Constantinople, the great city, the queen of cities, the greatest city on earth, also called Istanbul, as you can see from the title of this book. But what I'd love to do, if I can, is just to talk about the city and really why it matters in the world, why we need to study it, and to ask whether it deserves to have these extraordinary names. And I'm going to stick my neck out and be very ahistorical, and we're supposed to be very even-handed when we look at places, but I do think there is something very special about Constantinople. And it's not just its extraordinary deep history. It's not just its incredible cultural and architectural splendour. It's not just the fact that it is a city that has always occupied a very political space and, as ever, races up the political agenda. It's not any of those three single things. I think it's something greater. It's the fact that this is a city that has occupied and supported and nourished such a huge range of the human experience across time. It teaches us not just what it takes to make a city, but it teaches us what it takes us as humans to live together with one another. And I know that is a great big claim, but I think this weekend of all weekends in the year, with the commemoration of the terrible events at the Twin Towers, we need to be looking at why and how we can work out how to live together in grand metropolises and also in nation states. So I'm going to try to make this a very positive talk this evening. I so welcome your comments and questions at the end. But if I'd like you now just to close your eyes, if you can, take yourself back to the Eastern Mediterranean and to the extraordinary place that is the city of Istanbul, Constantinople. I'm going to be sharing with you some of the very latest archaeology that tells us about this city. But just before I do that, I wanted to share a story with you. So as Michael has said, I travel around the world. I'm very fortunate in I get to share my research on television and via books and radio, as well as in the academic world. And I have two daughters, and they've often come with me on these tours. And I have to say, sometimes when I say we're going to do yet another day-long or even 2-week-long walking tour of a historic city, you see their shoulders droop a little when they were teenagers. So we were in Istanbul and I said, okay, this time we're not just going to do a walking tour of the city. We're going to go on a boat and cross the Sea of Marmara in search of the incredible woman Theodora, the namesake of one of the donors of this lecture series. So Theodora, I'm sure, needs no introduction to you in the audience. She was the remarkable Byzantine empress of the 6th century AD, who started out right at the bottom of the social pile and ended up ruling 1 million square miles of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, her story is quite spectacular. And one of the things that we know about Theodora is that she was very keen on baths, on taking hot baths. And if you cross the Sea of Marmara from what was then Constantinople to the city of what is now Bursa and was Prusa, you find these remarkable hot baths where we know that Theodora chose to bathe. Being a woman who'd started with nothing, she was very keen that people should see that she was in royal progress. So we're told that when she travelled to these baths, she went with 4,000 courtiers. So it was quite an expedition. Also, just an interesting aside, she died very young, we think at age 48 or so, and almost certainly of breast cancer. And in fact, it could be that Theodora was the example of one of the first mastectomies in late antiquity. But I wonder if one of the reasons she was going to these baths was actually to try to alleviate those symptoms of her cancer. But for whatever reason, she went. So I said to my daughters, we're going to travel in the trail of Theodora. We're going to get on a boat, we're going to cross to Anatolia, across the Sea of Marmara, go to this beautiful hillside city of Bursa and try to find Theodora's baths, which remarkably still exist exactly as they did in the 6th century. So we did this. We went to Bursa, we got into the baths, very beautiful Byzantine and Ottoman historic baths, still used. Unfortunately, the section that Theodora used is now only men, so I was so frustrated that I couldn't get in there. So I did this slightly ludicrous exercise of sort of standing behind a screen and shifting my way so I could look into the baths, not computing, of course, that these were hot baths. And so there were men with very few clothes on. So I looked like some sort of strange peeping Tom. But it was a remarkable experience, because there I was, where this extraordinary woman had travelled and, enjoyed the experience of her power. Slightly embarrassing for my 2 daughters, obviously, that we'd gone into a hot bath where we shouldn't do. But it was a great historical moment. And as I came back towards the city of Istanbul, again on the ferry across the Sea of Marmara, I suddenly realized that the city I was returning to was on fire. We left a peaceful city, but this was 2013, and the Gezi Park protests, the Taksim Square riots, whatever you want to call them, had suddenly taken over the city. So the city was in flame. There were cars turned upside down. And we were staying in the Pera region, as you'll know, obviously a region that stayed European for many years into the 19th century. So we had to get back to our hotel. So I, again, took my daughters, thought, well, we have to sleep somewhere tonight, went into what was then a scene of great, violence and protest. And as we went through to the hotel, if we could just have the next slide, please, Michael. As we walked through the main shopping street, I suddenly saw this bit of graffiti, which had been left on one of the windows of the shops. And as you can see, it says, Istanbul, Byzantium, Constantinople, Bizim is ours. And it was a remarkable moment, because there I was in the middle of a highly charged political event. But somebody had chosen to put some historical graffiti onto the window. What they were saying is, this is a city that has such an extraordinary character. It has weathered so much through time. It has such resilience. It is a creature that is bigger than whoever is the ruler or leader or political faction in control at the time. It is a city that connects people across time. It's a place that is connected by time. And it, as I said, it was a really incredible moment to see this kind of historical statement in the middle of that. And it just reminded me that Constantinople is a dynamic city. It's protean and poetic. It's a city where the people on the streets have always wanted to have a voice and have a say. There's a fantastic chronicler called Niketis Choniates from the 12th century who says that Constantinople is a city where it is as though there is an indifference to the rulers inborn in the populace. And it's a city that's always been able to express itself, partly, I think, because it's such a remarkable city geographically, the city that's been described as a diamond that sits between 2 sapphires and emeralds, this kind of extraordinary rhino horn of land that jots out into the Sea of Marmara, bridged by the Bosphorus and then pierced by the Golden Horn. It is a city, as I said, that tells us what it takes to make it city, and we have to read the story of that city through the mood of the men in it. So as I said, what I want to do is take you on a whistle-stop archaeological tour of Constantinople and look not just at the fractures, but also at the continuity, not just at the times where it's a city that's been split apart by rivalry, but where people have tried to work together to make their city survive and so that they can flourish as a community. So we'll start right at the very beginning. If I could just have the next slide, please. Constantinople is a city which, as I'm sure you will know if any of you have managed to visit it or have heard what's going on there, is there's a huge amount of development in the city. Tunnels have been built under the Bosphorus for road and for rail. There's a new metro system, a lot of development in the historic centre. And because of this building, because it's rebuilding itself as a world-class city, we are finding more and more extraordinary evidence of its deep past. And what you're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen, I showed this slide recently in Oxford, and somebody rather unhelpfully asked me whether it was an avocado holder. Not an avocado holder, something far more exciting than that. What you're looking at here is a footprint which is over 8,000 years old. And this is a footprint that was left by one of the very earliest inhabitants of Constantinople in the pre-Bosphorus mud. And we have about 2,000 or so of these incredible footprints of women, of men, of children, some with bare feet, some, as this gentleman has, with a little leather shoe. And these were the people who, in that very, very early time in prehistory in the city, decided that this was a place that had a kind of magic to it and laid down their roots as a very early community, Neolithic community. We have incredible remnants of their lives, beautiful spoons made out of wild cow bone, combs for their hair, the world's oldest wooden coffin, a sort of lattice wooden coffin with its inhabitant, a 35-year-old or so woman in the fetal position inside. Possibly also the world's oldest canoe paddle has been discovered here. And the archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence tells us this was a rich and beautiful place. It was a place that was teeming with life. 9,000 species of flora, giant deers, pistachio and chestnut and oak forests and fig forests. So we have to imagine these early inhabitants waking up in the morning and going and collecting their fresh pistachios for breakfast. So a place that had extraordinary potential and almost a sort of paradisical sense to it, which is something which is a term often applied to the city of Constantinople through time. So we have to imagine this plucky early community making a life for themselves, but then things would drastically change. And if we could have the next slide, please. Around 5,500 BCE, there is an incredible geoseismic event and a rise in sea levels. And what you're looking at here is a kind of prehistoric map of the area around Constantinople, what is now Europe and Asia. But 5,500 years ago, these two land masses were joined. And what happened is, over an incredibly short period of time, over a period of only 300 days, the sea level rose by around 238 feet, which we just stop for a moment and do the maths, you realise that's a really extraordinary level of rise. And it's been estimated about 10 cubic miles of water came pouring over the land lip, flooding around 600 miles of land, and that created the Bosphorus. It created this line of water which now separates Asia and Europe, and which is central to both the story and to the history of Constantinople. Lives were destroyed. More and more settlements are now being discovered under the Black Sea that were flooded by that rise in sea levels. And just a little fact for you, fantastic, very recent research has discovered that underneath the Bosphorus, there is a submerged river which is running in the opposite direction to the Bosphorus channel. So there's a freshwater river right at the base of the Bosphorus, which partly explains the extraordinary pulsing, tide-turning nature of that stretch of water, where the tide changes directions around 9 times or so over just 21 or so kilometers. So it's a very dynamic place. It's a stretch of water, the Bosphorus, that forces you to approach the city of Constantinople on the front foot. It gives a sort of brio, a kind of dangerous energy to the city. And I think it's in a way something which incarnates the spirit of that place, which is both delightful and tempting, but also dangerous. But it's a city which has always attracted travellers. If we could just have the next slide, please. Because, of course, very famously, some of the first who come to this extraordinary place are the Greeks. And I just wanted to show you this slide, which is a Kurgan, a Central Asian influenced tomb, which dates back to around 2000 BCE, which was discovered in Silivri, which was one of the areas which had been inhabited originally by the Greeks. This predates the Greeks. So it's just an example again of what a kind of mixed community there is in what we now call Constantinople. The next slide, please. Again, you can see the figure there curled up in a fetal position, still in the tomb. This, though, is the ancient city. So I've added here a few details of the city, which is really now becoming a city as we know it. The city that is going to be called Byzantion, that will become Byzantium for the Romans, a city which has huge influence from the Greeks. Again, you all know the story. I'm sure that a group of very brave adventurers travelled out from the mainland city-state of Megara, pretty close to Athens, a city-state which needed help. Somebody wrote about Megara on mainland Greece and said it was a place where men farmed rocks. It's not hugely fertile. And if you go to Megara, you see that actually the port is a thing that really matters to this town. And we know that in the 7th centuries and 6th centuries, men travelled out, and women, from Megara across the Aegean, across the Mediterranean, through the Sea of Marmara, up to the headland of what is now Constantinople. And they founded a city there. Initially, they founded it on the other side, on the Asian side of the Bosphorus, and what came to be called the City of the Blind, because people realized that actually Byzantium, what is now Constantinople, was the correct geographical area to found a city. And pretty soon, the Megarans come to the place that they then called Byzantium. The name, of course, people always say, why was it called this extraordinary name? The story went, the Greeks told one another that, again, the story that you will all know, that Zeus, the king of the gods, was having an affair with a mortal, as was his wont, Io, one of the priestesses of his wife Hera, and Zeus chases Io, who's been turned into the form of a cow. She jumps across the stretch of water, the Bosphorus, the cow carrying stretch, which is why the Bosphorus gets its name. Io then gives birth to a daughter herself, Keroessa. Keroessa is a woman who has an affair with Poseidon, the god of the sea. Very important, this, because the sea and waterways are essential to the health of the city of Constantinople. And the son that Keroessa gives birth to is the hero Byzas, and we're told that it was Byzas who founded the city of Byzantium. That is a myth. We know that this isn't true. We know that there were earlier inhabitants there, but it's really the Greeks who turn this into a city that has a chance to be a world-class city. As you can see, there are some very typical ancient buildings here. They found baths, they found gymnasia, stoa, a beautiful water system. They're Doric Greek, so there's a kind of Doric feeling to the foundations of the early city. It is also a city, though, that still is influenced by the East, and it's one of the things that I personally love about this city. It allows there to be very many different ways to be Greek, for instance, at the time. And so some of the gods and goddesses that were worshipped in the city, alongside the ones that you'd expect, Apollo and Aphrodite and Artemis, high from either the East or from North Africa. So Serapis was worshipped here, Isis, and goddesses who originate in Anatolia in the Hittite culture. And one of the goddesses who was very, very important to this city was the great goddess Cybele. If we could just have the next slide, please. So Cybele, here you can see her, you'll know her, she's a goddess of nature, always flanked by these extraordinary lions, a goddess who sits between life and death, and in fact controls the access to life and death itself. And it's really critical that we recognize that she was a goddess who was adored by the inhabitants of what would become Constantinople, which was then Byzantium, because this was thought to be a city that itself gave you access to the possibilities of life and could bring death, because it was a city that always sat right at a front seat at the theatre of war and the theatre of the power conflicts of the time. So Cybele was worshipped with great gusto in the city. If any of you know anything about this kind of wonderful goddess, she's uber female. It was said that her priests, the Galli, had to self-castrate themselves so that they couldn't be male in front of her femaleness. And she's worshipped in Constantinople right the way through the Christian period as well. She's a really critically important goddess for the city. And very interestingly, there's work being done at the moment that's looking at the equivalent of Cybele and Gaia, and this notion of needing to worship a nature goddess in a city, because if we're going to develop cities, we still need to keep nature on side, something that we realise ever more so now with the issues of climate change and our overuse of cities. But the early Greeks really got that. They were very aware that nature had to be a part of any city, and it's one of the reasons that Cybele was worshipped. We'd just have the next slide, please. Another goddess, again, sort of goddess, sorceress, witch with Eastern connections, but who was much, I wouldn't say adored by the Greeks, but respected by the Greeks, was this interesting woman, Hecate. And you can see that Hecate appears on the early coins of Byzantium. Hecate, again, was a goddess who was and sorceress who was often in charge of liminal spaces, so harbours, places with walls, places where there were exits and entrances, and Constantinople, Byzantium, is nothing if not a city which encourages people to come in across its borders and thresholds. So again, there's a reason that Hecate was worshipped there. I also included this coin just out of interest. You can see what Hecate's symbol was. It's this crescent moon with a star, which of course you will recognize on the Turkish flag today. And it always amuses me sometimes when people say, oh, you know, the early history of the city is irrelevant to the modern city of Istanbul. And you think, well, not entirely relevant. Let's look at Hecate's symbol, which was stamped on all those Byzantine coins. This is a symbol which incidentally was again very popular in the later Byzantine Empire and appears on the symbol of aristocrats when the Byzantine Empire was in exile, as it were, in Morea. So it's a symbol that is still used, and as I said, which then goes on a sort of little journey around the East and ends up on the flags today. So if we could just have the next slide, please. So a city, as I said, which is has huge Greek influence, huge Doric Greek influence, but also kind of is very confident about embracing ideas from the East as well. A city, of course, that has always had extraordinary commercial and economic potential. And the Greeks recognized this, but so did our friends, the Romans. I am as very open about this. I'm much more of a fan of ancient Greek civilization than I am of ancient Roman. I know that's a rather bold statement to make, but the Romans, you know, they always follow the money. And so the Romans were very interested in this city-state of Byzantium, which they then took over. And what you're looking at here, right in the heart of the historic center of Constantinople today, is the Milion. If any of you have been to the city, you'll recognize it. A very sort of unprepossessing ancient monument, but this is actually one of the most important ancient monuments, I would argue, to survive still in the world. This is really kind of ground zero for the Roman, the sense of the Roman Empire as an empire that has a center that isn't Rome. So what you're looking at here is the mother of all mile markers. So set up by the Emperor Septimius Severus around 200 AD, this is the point from which all the distances of the Roman Empire were measured. And again, if you just think about that psychologically, what that means, that's sending out a message to the whole of Rome that this extraordinary city of Byzantium was the center of everything. And one of the reasons that the Romans set up the Milion there was, again, because of its huge military strategic strength as a city, but also because of its economic heft. And if we can just have the next slide, please. And I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I realise I'm rattling through centuries of history, but it's such a rich story. So the economic possibilities of this city are extraordinary and remarkable. And this has been brilliantly demonstrated in recent archaeology in the city with the excavation of the harbour of the Emperor Theodosius. I'm still, I love all archaeology, and it still blows me away each time I see these images. So what you're looking at here are boats that were excavated from a harbour which was operational from the 4th century to the 10th or 11th centuries AD. That was when it was at its height. And so far, no fewer than 37 almost entire boats have been excavated from this remarkable site, which was again being dug when the infrastructure of the modern city was being developed. And because of the particular conditions of the Bosphorus mud here, the level of survival, the degree of survival is just incredible. So in this boat, for instance, there is coiled ship's rope. There was a brazier where the captain had enjoyed his last meal. There was a little reed basket full of cherry stones. So we know that those sailors absolutely loved eating cherries. Also animal bones. Really interestingly, it looks like they're ostrich bones which have been butchered. So that we know that ostrich meat was being eaten. And also the bones of big cats and animals who have been brought into the arena in Byzantium, which of course was the second Rome, the new Rome. So because it was Roman influenced, there were animal fights in the arena, and we find these animal bones in these incredible remains. One of the other things that turns up in these boats, if we could just have the next slide, please, are a lot of these things. You will all recognize these. They are amphorae, and amphorae very specifically for transporting wine. There was a lot of wine that came from across the Greek world in and out of the city of Constantinople. This particular boat has a consignment of wine from Thasos, from the beautiful island, Greek island of Thasos, famed for its wine and for its honey. And for anybody in the room who's interested in history or archaeology, you'll understand that this is one of those really thrilling moments where the archaeology in the ground backs up a few scant historical sources, because we'd always been told that Constantinople was a city that was a pleasure-seeking city, a city that really enjoyed its partying and its drinking. Just for instance, I'll quote you the great playwright and poet Menander, from Greek poet from the 4th century BCE. He says of Byzantium, "Byzantion makes all her merchants drunkards. The whole night through, for your sake, we were drinking, and frankly, it was darn strong wine too. At any rate, I rose this morning with a head for 4. And then Moero, who was a poetess of Byzantium, interestingly, and this is something which I'll be exploring with you, this very interesting particular quirk of the city, that it was a city that always seemed to support women, female authors and writers, more than other cities of the time. So Moero, the Greek poetess of Byzantium, writing in the 3rd century BC, is a slightly more romantic in her description of the drinking culture of the city. She says, "Cluster of grapes, full of the drops of Dionysus, you rest indeed under the cover of Aphrodite's golden chambers. No longer will your mother vine throw the beloved vine twig around you. Spring forth the divine leaf over your head. Dionysus, Bacchus, we worship you." So, as I say, this is a beautiful archaeological find, but also a very exciting one, because it confirms the literary texts that were telling us that this was a city that really enjoyed its booze. So it's a city that has a reputation for being a bit of a party city. As I've shown with the Milion, it's a city which is economically and militarily very strategic. It's a city with many characteristics and very deep roots, but it was, of course, also a sacred city. And if we could have the next slide, please. And really fascinatingly, it's a city that is sacred to a number of cultures without actually anything particularly significant, religious or in sacred terms, having happened there. But it's such a beautiful city. It's such an energetic city. Its rulers almost give it a kind of gloss of sacredness and just persuade people that this is a city that really matters in sacred terms. And of course, the master of this was the Emperor Constantine, who makes this city of Byzantium his new headquarters. And he is the man, of course, who gives the city its name, Constantinople. And this is now a Christian city. And what you're looking at here, if any of you have been to the city, you'll recognize it. These are the remains of the extraordinary column of Constantine, still in the city, just outside the Grand Bazaar, made of this beautiful porphyry, this purple marble. It's still impressive today. It's about 116 feet. It was 160 feet originally. So it was an extraordinary statement of power. And on top of the porphyry marble was this very intriguing statue of a male figure. We don't know whether it's Constantine himself. We don't know whether it's the Greek god Apollo. We don't know whether it's the Roman-influenced god Sol Invictus, another sun god, but a god who was very popular with Roman soldiers particularly, or whether it's an image of Christ, or all of those sort of slightly mixed up. And it's one of the things that the city is very good at doing. It's a sort of magpie culture. It takes influences from all kinds of places. Whatever it was, this was a symbol shouting with symbolism. So for instance, on that beautiful, you can see his beautiful solar crown on top of the statue. It was said that the nails that had nailed Christ to the cross were melded into that crown. As you go down the column, we have other significant aspects. So Noah's axe, his adze, the instrument that he used to build the ark, was said to be buried underneath the pediment of the column, as was indeed no less than the panniers that Jesus Christ himself used to feed the 5,000. And then just to kind of keep the old gods on side, we're also told that Constantine added underneath here the Palladium, the extraordinary image of Pallas Athene, which had been taken from Troy to Rome and had now been brought back by Constantine from Rome to his new great Christian city of Constantinople. So it's a kind of brilliant monument, this, because it explains the varied influences in the city and the fact that people were very comfortable with having a variety of influences, and they allowed them to coexist in a very potent way alongside one another. So it's a city that has now got a real sense of its own sanctity and its importance religiously. And this was not, I used the word gloss before, and I shouldn't have used that at all. This was something which was very heartfelt, very sincerely felt in the city. And it was a city, really fascinatingly, that starts to promote itself as a city of social justice to a quite extraordinary, unprecedented degree. It was a city, and this was what was written about it, where it was said, the piety of Constantinople's builders and her inhabitants and their compassion and liberality towards the poor are the thing that makes this city great. So it was a city, as I said, that really looked after people and promoted the fact that it looked after people. 80,000 a day were given a bread ration. There was a tax on merchants' workshops so that the poor could be given a decent burial. And it was also a city that gave sanctuary to outsiders, and particularly to refugees. And it got this reputation far and wide as a city that could welcome you in if you were in distress. So much so that actually there was a special officer, a quaestor, who was the refugee official of Constantinople. And this was something really interestingly for me, that is a hallmark of the city that carries right the way through to even to the 21st centuries, when, as we know, many refugees from Syria ended up in what is now Istanbul. And if we could just have the next slide, please. I just have to show you this. This was in the build up to the First World War, when in the terrible times when armies were crossing the areas of Europe and Anatolia, and a number of children were being orphaned. Children, without prompting, without any adults accompanying them, knew, because this is something that had been told at their mother's knee, that nursery rhymes had sung of, knew that if they could get to the city of Constantinople, then they would be given sanctuary. And this is just a very touching, I think, little image of some children being housed in one of the great mosques in the city. You can see their blankets drying behind them. The next slide, please. But the woman who I started this talk with, who absolutely wears the crown in terms of her extraordinary generosity when it came to supporting refugees, was none other than the great Empress Theodora herself. And here she is in all her glory in that famous Ravenna mosaic. This is Theodora in the centre here. Now, Theodora, as I said, really was a remarkable woman. We think that she almost certainly came from either Cyprus or Syria originally. Her father was a bear tamer. Her mother was a prostitute, what would now be called a sex worker. So they are a very, very lowly family. And Theodora entertained in the hippodrome with erotic dances and gymnastics, but she was far more than just that. She was obviously a woman who was whiplash smart. She leaves the city of Constantinople. She converts to Christianity. She's spotted by the agents of the emperor, who understand how clever she is, and she's recruited as a spy. She has a series of husbands, basically sort of advancing her way up the social scale, comes back into the city of Constantinople, and somehow, we're not sure how, attracts the attention of the soon-to-be emperor Justinian, who changes the law so that an emperor can marry an actress, in inverted commas. And the two of them marry, and they are the most remarkable power couple. And my goodness, they put their money where their mouth is in terms of social reform. So as soon as Theodora has power, she helps with legal reforms that outlaw forms of prostitution and increase the penalties for rape and outlaw infanticide. She sets up a safe house for fallen women and single mothers, the foundations of which are still visible on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus. And again, we know that she welcomed in refugees and those seeking refuge to her palace, so not just to a sort of refugee camp, but right into the personal quarters of the palace, rather brilliantly, because we have the remnants of a letter from a builder at the time, and we're talking the 6th century AD, don't forget, so this is 1400 years ago, a builder who complains that he's having to restructure the flooring of one of the rooms in Theodora's palace because she's welcomed in so many refugees that the floor has broken, and it's a real sort of moany letter. But actually, just from this, we understand that as I said, that Theodora really did provide sanctuary to those who came and claimed it at her city. A remarkable woman, and a woman who spread Greco-Roman influence right the way across Europe. If we could just have the next slide, please. Because this is something, of course, being British, something I'm very interested in. This was a city that had connections right way across to what were considered the wild, dangerous western edges of the old Roman Empire. And what you're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen, is the beautiful headland of Tintagel in northern Cornwall, which is, of course, the headland that was supposed to be the legendary home of the legendary King Arthur. And I've included this for a very particular reason. So this has been, as I said, it's a 6th century reconstruction of the exact headland. And if you can see on your screens, on this really pretty small headland, there are homes and workshops and storerooms. And these were revealed only in 1983, when there was a scrub fire on the headland, which burnt back some of the bushes. And these extraordinary collection of, as I said, homes and storehouses and warehouses were exposed. Only 10% of that area has been excavated so far, but there's a huge amount of material. And on this tiny headland in northern Cornwall, you find there is more Byzantine pottery, so more pottery that originated in Constantinople than anywhere else in Western Europe. And that's just from an excavation of 10% of this tiny headland. So that tells us that there was a vast amount of traffic across the ocean, right the way through the Mediterranean, through the Atlantic and round to Cornwall, which is why the archaeologists here helpfully put some little boats on to make this point. Now, this is an incredible journey, and many people have asked why the Byzantines bothered with this kind of wild, salt-whipped outpost of the old Roman Empire. And I think there are two very important things to remember here. One is the fact that it was really Constantinople saying, we are still the centre of the known world. And we know that actually Justinian offered what he called subsidies for the barbarians of Britannia. I'm not sure I like being called a barbarian of Britannia, but at the time to help those who lived here in the 6th century AD. Possibly the ships were coming here to get tin to create bronze, because Cornwall produces a huge amount of tin. But I think it was more a notion of the importance of the interconnectedness of the world, is why these boats were sent all these thousands of miles across those dangerous oceans to keep the kind of connectivity through to Constantinople. So I said, not just tin, but something of a kind of bigger political and social statement. And if we could just have the next slide, please. So this is a beautiful necklace from the Anglo-Saxon period. And we know that women in Britain at the time were wearing jewels, again, exactly as Theodora would have worn. So if you remember that beautiful necklace that Theodora was wearing in the Ravenna mosaic, the nobles of Anglo-Saxon England copied her and tried to dress as the Byzantine empress, again, showing the great influence across this vast stretch of land. If we could just have the next slide, please. Thank you. And also, if any of you know of the Sutton Hoo ship burial in Britain, this remarkable ship burial of an Anglo-Saxon lord, in that burial, beautiful silverware and ivoryware from Constantinople has been found, forged and minted and crafted in Constantinople. And there are current digs where we know that a lot of coins, these are coins that were all minted in Byzantium, have turned up in the living quarters of the dead king of Sutton Hoo. So again, showing us that even right at the edges of Britain, this was a city that had huge influence, both economic and cultural, and actually, I think, psychological. If we can just go to the next slide, please. So here we are in this golden age city. This is the glorious city of Constantinople in the 10th century AD, as imagined. As I don't know if you agree, I love this picture. It looks to me as though I'm looking at kind of Florence or Siena or something, an absolutely extraordinary place with the hippodrome there in the centre, the harbour of Theodosius that you can see, again, these great influences from the Greek and Roman world playing out. But the thing is that jewels like these attract thieves. And of course, people have wanted to invade Constantinople, Byzantium through the centuries. The Arabs attacked close on 12 times. The Vikings attacked a number of times as well. The Vikings were slightly obsessed with Constantinople. And there's a rather brilliant law that gets passed that says that the Vikings can start to come into the city, but only if they come through a particular gate, and if they promise not to attack any men or violently attack any women, that they will be allowed in 50 at a time. And we know that the Vikings came into the city because if any of you have been to the great, beautiful church of Hagia Sophia, of course, again, rebuilt by Justinian and Theodora, you'll see that not only are there Viking runes that have been scratched into the marble there, but recently somebody's identified a beautiful Viking longboat that has been scratched into one of the columns. So as I said, it's a city that is bound to attract thieves because it is just such a kind of stunning world-class city. At this time that you're looking at the image on the screen, it was bigger, 10 times bigger than any other European city. And unfortunately for Byzantium, it's a city that also attracts the attention of Frankish Crusader knights. And in 1204, one of the most devastating attacks on Constantinople comes from fellow Christians in what has to be one of the grubbiest, saddest episodes of global history, when Crusaders come to the east and they ring around Constantinople and they manage to persuade themselves that those in Constantinople of the Orthodox Church are the wrong kinds of Christians, and they lay waste to the city. And at this time, so many inhabitants in Byzantium are literate. We have these terrible accounts of their shock and horror at being betrayed by fellow Christians, whereas actually a lot of the Frankish knights who are attacking are illiterate. So it's one of those rare moments when history isn't written by the victor, but by the victim. And this is just one of the many incredibly moving accounts of that attack of the Fourth Crusade. Tearing children from mothers and mothers from children, treating the Virgin with wanton shame in holy chapels, viewing with fear neither the wrath of God nor the vengeance of men, the Crusaders, in the name of God, destroyed much of what they found in their path. This was in 1204, and it's a devastating moment for the city. Parchments and papyrus are ripped up and burnt, icons are destroyed, images of the Virgin Mary are ripped out so that jewels can be taken from icons. A huge amount of cultural wealth is lost in the city, and a huge body of work, as I was saying earlier, written interestingly by the women of the city, because it's a city that for some reason always allowed women to have status and standing and to have an artistic and cultural voice. One of those extraordinary Byzantine poets, who many of whose works were destroyed in that crusade, was the wonderful woman Cassia, who some of you may know, who's a remarkable poetess who's written at least 260 non-liturgical verses, as well as the 40 or so liturgical verses that we know. And some of you, I'm sure, will know that on Holy Tuesday, hymns of Cassiani are still sung. And this was this noble woman from Constantinople who was really an example of the kind of epitome of learning and cultural sensitivity and sophistication that there was in the city. She was a woman, for instance, who we know from the quotations within her poetry was familiar with the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the works of Greek tragedians and the Greek dramatists. So a beautiful city at this time, rich and wonderful, and it was a terrible thing when it was attacked in 1204. And in some senses, I kind of feel the city never quite regained its sense of itself, this kind of glorious golden envy of the known world. Almost it seems as though it loses its mojo. And at this point, of course, the Ottomans have come from the east. They're circling around in Anatolia and in Europe, and they continue to do that for 150 years afterwards, until eventually it's only Constantinople that is independent, and the Ottomans have taken over the rest of the land around it. And eventually, of course, as we know, Constantinople falls in 1453. It becomes an Ottoman city. And changes in so many ways after that. As I said, though, today, particularly because of where we are in history now, in remembering 9/11, I think it's important for us to remember that as well as this takeover, there were moments of continuity, and there were people within that city who still wanted to appreciate what the Greeks had created in this extraordinary world-class city of Constantinople. So if we could just have the next slide, please. The Ottomans are in charge, but some of those in charge still want to have this sense that this is a Renaissance city that really makes the best of the European artists at the time. I just had to show you this. This is a beautiful sketchbook from none other than Leonardo da Vinci, the incredibly famous Renaissance artist. And what Leonardo da Vinci is doing in this little sketchbook, I don't know if you can see, this is a little boat going under a bridge, and that is a bridge across the Golden Horn, because one of the sultans wanted a bridge had a bridge building contest, and he wanted all the great artists from the time to apply. And as I said, no less than Leonardo da Vinci himself applied to build this bridge. And we even have the letter that he wrote to the Sultan. I, your servant, have heard that you intend to construct a bridge from Istanbul to Galata, but you could not, because no expert could be found. I, your servant, I have to say, when you get this sense on this letter that Leonardo da Vinci is not lacking in ego. I am the man to make this bridge for you. I will raise an arch so high that nobody would want to pass over it. I will construct it in such a way that even a sailing ship can pass under it. I am the man for this job. And as I said, you can see the little sailing ship that he's etched into one of his notebooks. Leonardo da Vinci's letter joins a pile of other letters, and obviously the Sultan goes, Leonardo who, and the bridge never gets built. But it's just a little hint at the fact that this is a city that still had cultural contact with many from outside. And if I could just have the next slide, please. Something which is still seen in the historic skyline of Constantinople, Istanbul today. What you're looking at here, of course, is the extraordinary Süleymaniye mosque built by the great architect Sinan, responsible for so much of the historic skyline of Constantinople in the Ottoman period. Sinan, though, as we know, although in the 1930s people desperately tried to say that he was a Turk, it was almost certainly a Greek or Armenian, and he used all his Renaissance powers to kind of create beauty in the city, installing, for instance, a Helmholtz resonator of inverted amphorite pots in the top of that dome, so that the music and the sounds of the dome could be reflected around. So it's a city which has passed through so many hands, but a city which, as I said, if you just look at that picture and the extraordinary geography of the place, a city which has always had great resilience, a city which is a character in and of itself, and a city which has welcomed many. There have been terrible times, as we know, in the history of this city, but it's also been a city which has understood that in order not just to survive, but to thrive, cities have to welcome others across their borders and boundaries. And one of the reasons I started off saying that, I was going to stick my neck out and say that this was indeed one of the very greatest cities on earth. One of the reasons I think that Constantinople is such a remarkable city is that it's a city that is constitutionally cosmopolitan. Diogenes the Cynic, the great Greek cynic who came up with this notion of the cosmopolitan, the citizen of the world, we think almost certainly travelled past ancient Byzantium. And it's a city, as I said, which has understood right from its beginning that it needs to, in order to be a great city, you have to allow influences in and out. At its very worst, it's a prejudiced city. At its very best, it's a city that embraces all comers. And I hope with great passion that it's a city that will relive its extraordinary city, its extraordinary iteration as a cosmopolitan city full of women and men from many cultures across the world. It's a city, as I said, that's been described as the greatest city on earth, the queen of cities, the golden apple, a virgin who's enjoyed many husbands. It's been described as Napoleon himself said that if the world were one country, then Istanbul, Constantinople, would be its capital. And as I said, it feels to me it is one of the greatest cities on earth because it reminds us what it is to be a world citizen. And in this lecture series, which has been stimulated by the 200th anniversary of the 1821 Wars of Independence, what we should remember is that those revolutionaries, whether they were in Nafplion or Athens or in Kefalonia on the Greek islands, they often said that where they needed to be, what they wanted their capital to be was simply what they called the city. And by this, of course, they meant the great city of Constantinople. So thank you so much. I've seen that the time has ticked away. I've been talking solidly for an hour. I'm so sorry. And Mike will be cross with me because I promised that I would leave good time for questions. But I hope that you share kind of my passion and adoration for this extraordinary place, which owes so much to its foundation as a Greek city-state 2,600 years ago, and a city that I hope will have a great cosmopolitan future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettany. I must apologize. I disconnected my camera and I don't know how to put it back on. So I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Well, that was an amazing lecture. Thank you so much. What I really appreciated is that you didn't just give us a dry history of the city, but you talked about these major themes that define what the city was from antiquity to its more recent present. Anything from how they drank their wine and how important that was, to how welcoming they were to refugees and poor people, and especially how the city was defined by Justinian and Theodora. So thank you so much for this lecture, Bettany. It's a huge topic. It's very hard to cover Constantinople in a day, let alone in 50 minutes.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple of questions, and I put a note in the chat. So please do not use the chat to submit questions. Use the Q&A feature. So kindly type the question and then I can read it for our speaker. And there are already a couple of questions that I hear. The first one from Michael Costello. How was it that Constantine, who was a regional general guarding Hadrian's Wall, became emperor of the eastern capital of Constantinople? What was the trajectory that brought Constantine there?
Yeah, well, of course, you're right, and again, it's for me as somebody who's standing here now in England and having seen where he was proclaimed emperor. It was an extraordinary series of events. Exactly as you said, there was activity from the Roman army right up in the north of England. Constantine's father was trying to subdue these very restless tribes. His father dies, and Constantine is proclaimed emperor in York. There is then some power struggle ensues. It's a time where there are four men who all think that they should actually by rights be ruling the new Roman Empire. And there's a series of battles, particularly one which is on just at the bottom edge of the Bosphorus. You can go there today. You can still see the battle site on the Asian side. And to cut a very long story very short, Constantine eventually defeats his arch enemy, who had at one point been his ally, Licinius. And at that point, he is the most potent sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Really interestingly, it's a brilliant question, because Constantine wasn't complete. He knew that he had to make a very bold statement that this was a fresh start and that his power base was now going to be further east. And I always say, in many ways, I think Rome never fell. It simply moved 854 miles to the east. So Constantine originally toyed with the idea of founding his headquarters in Troy, because this was a city that had such extraordinary resonance for everyone. It was known of in myths. It was known as being, again, a sort of political hot potato between east and west. So he does toy with the idea of founding his city in Troy, but then he goes for what it was then Byzantium and renames it Constantinople. And oh my goodness, wasn't that a fantastic decision? Because Troy, if any of you have been there, it's a very evocative place, but it doesn't have the potential for being a world-class harbour that can, channel the trade from east, west, north and south, as Constantinople still does indeed. So it was an absolute stroke of genius.
Thank you. Speaking of harbors, the second question is whether there is any underwater archaeology going on right now in the area.
That is a brilliant question. And yes, there is, very excitingly. So I was in the city about a month ago. On the Asian side of the Bosphorus, there's some very exciting digs, again, looking at the prehistoric foundations of the city. And we think that we've identified a very, 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 very early Bronze Age harbour there. And there are also, I'm sure you'll have seen some of the news reports in the last couple of weeks. There's a lot of work up on the Black Sea end of the Bosphorus, and just in the Black Sea itself, there's been an exquisite, Michael, I know that your wife Deborah will be exceptionally excited about this Greek trading ship that it's been discovered staggeringly well preserved, again in the kind of mud at the bottom of the Black Sea. So there is a lot of underwater archaeology going on, and I always say to people, if there's anybody who's watching today who's a student themselves, or has a son or daughter, or even grandson or daughter, who wants to find work to do in this archaeological world, there are 90,000 crates of material excavated from the Yenikapi harbour and around, much of which is still waiting for examination. So you can have a job for life. So I would really advise, if you want to go and expand your mind, it's a very good place to try to find work. Just interestingly, just a little tiny addition to that question. When I was in the city, as I said, about a month ago, I actually held one of the, in effect, freeze-dried planks from that boat that I showed you in the image, and looked at the incredible caulking of it and the bitumen that was used to help to prepare the planks. And it's a very, very, very touching moment. And I can kind of share a little insider secret that they've discovered that one of the best things to preserve this wood is that it obviously has to stay in waterlogged, that's come out of this dig. And there's a real issue with mosquitoes laying there being mosquito larvae in the water. So there are these beautiful goldfish that they have swimming around the wooden planks that have been preserved in Theodosian Harbour, just very gently eating the mosquito larvae. So it's a rather special, magical place.
Of course. From Dimitrios Matsakis, great talk. And I have to tell you, Bethany, that we have quite a few comments in the chat about how wonderful your talk was. Thank you.
Thank
you. From Dimitrios, would you say that the rules prohibiting the Vikings from being too violent towards women would be considered very weak by today's standards?
Again, fascinating question. And isn't that a kind of remarkable bit of a kind of historical detail? I think what was going on is that basically the Vikings and the Byzantines have a love-hate relationship with one another at this time. The Vikings are frankly obsessed with Byzantium. They love all the silverware that it produces. They love the purple silks that are produced by Byzantium. And again, it's something often I don't think we imagine when we think of the Vikings, but the Vikings had these on their Viking boats, often used Byzantine purple silk on their sails, and used to wear Byzantine silk purple scarves as well, which is kind of not quite the image that we have of the kind of rough and ready Viking. But some of them convert to Christianity. So I think, it's a very interesting question. I think at that very particular moment in time, basically the Byzantine authorities were trying to extend an olive branch to say, look, rather than this constant raiding, some of you are now Christians. Why don't we kind of collaborate together against what could have then been the common enemy of the Arabs? So I think that's what was going on. I think it was an interesting, not an expression of weakness, but an expression of a diplomatic expression at the time. I don't know if you have these in the States. In England, when I was a child, people in little newsagents on the corners of shops, they used to have little notices up saying that only 2 children could come in at a time, and they had to behave themselves and they mustn't steal any of the sweets. I don't know if it was the same, and you're probably too well behaved in America. This was a very common thing in Britain in the 1970s and 80s. And that letter to the Vikings always reminds me of those little notices, a kind of polite notice put up in a shop saying you're welcome as long as you behave.
Thank you, Bethany. There are a couple of more questions, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. Bethany, is it okay if I ask people to email me these questions and then I can forward them to you? And again, to those of you who just sent in questions, I'm sorry, I have to stop the event here. Please email me your questions and Bethany will be happy to send us the answers. Bethany, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you once again. Thank you so much for being here. We know how, I don't think that people realize how busy you are and how difficult it is for you to find the time to do this. So we're really grateful that you took the time out of your busy schedule to join us. Good luck with your endeavors. I know you just came back from the Aegean and you're leaving again. So good luck with all your projects. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. One final note of thanks to Bob L., who organized all this, all the logistics. Bob, as always, we are very appreciative of your help. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again at our next event. Bye-bye.